Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Daytripper Television. I'm Ross Chevalier.
And I'm Brian Weiss. On today's episode, we're going to cover the art and physics of light. And we're also going to get into how light actually impacts your light choice.
Next, we're going to talk about what the heck is white balance and what does it actually mean to us as photographers. And then Brian is going to step in and be the working pro in our tips from the working pro session to talk about how to photograph in different types of light, how to get the best possible images here on Daytripper Television. In our first segment, we want to talk about light, because light is everything to photography.
Absolutely.
There's no light, there's no pictures.
No photo in the graphy.
No photo in the graphy. So what is light really? Well, I think we're all very comfortable with the concept of light being a series of rays. And we've thrown up a simple graphic that, well, everyone should recognize, and if you don't recognize it, ask your parents. The idea is that light appears to us as white, but in fact is a collection of different colors that move at different wavelengths, and that in fact has different temperatures. When we think about light, how we manipulate light determines how we manipulate our photographs. Now, when we look at light, we're measuring light when we make a photograph based on the concept of reflection. What we see in our photograph is light that's reflected from our subject. And there are a lot of things that can influence that reflected light. The sheen on the subject, how bright, shiny the subject is. The color of the subject. White objects reflect more light. Black objects not only don't really reflect more light, they actually absorb light. In this graphic, what we see are a couple of key elements that you might remember from high school science about how light works. So when you look at the image, you'll see an incident light ray. Incident means incoming. It's coming in and it's striking the surface, and that causes the illumination that we use to make a photograph. The angle that the light makes when it hits the subject is called the angle of incidence. So how we're hitting the subject. And this is what produces shadows. And shadows are pretty freaking important to a good photograph, because a perfectly flat lighting is incredibly boring.
Shadow adds drama, it adds mood and feel to the shot.
Exactly. Now, when light reflects away, it moves away at exactly the same angle that it came in on the angle of incidence, called the angle of reflectance. So when we position ourselves with our cameras where we set up to take the photograph is going to have a huge impact on what the photograph looks like based on where the light is coming from. If we position ourselves so the light is hitting us directly, we're going to get a certain shot. If we position ourselves in line with the light hitting our subject, we're going to get a different look. And if we position ourselves off the angle of incidence, we're going to get the shadows that you talked about. That idea of drama, the ability to manipulate and control light. We also have to be careful about reflectance, though, because what happens if you're right in the angle of reflectance?
Well, you got not the best image that you're looking for, at least, guaranteed.
Exactly. We're going to get maybe a hot spot, some glare, and sometimes that can be effective. You know, if I was shooting Brian, I might want a halo of light around him, to create separation between his hair and the background, but I have to think about that. And how we understand light and how it moves is going to be really important to us. Now, in the graphic, there's also something called refraction. And when we look at the refraction, what that tells us is that as light moves through a medium, the direction of the light changes. Now, again, if you think back to your school science, if you put a straw in a glass of water,
it bends.
It looks like it bends. And that's all refraction is. So as light moves through the glass elements in your lens, it bends. That's how we create focus.
That's right.
It's really that simple. There's no more to it than that. Now, light is more than just a series of rays. Light also has color. And the thing, you said it in an earlier episode, our eyes are amazing. They can make anything look normal.
But a camera sees things differently.
Right.
The camera doesn't understand light in the same way, does it?
The camera doesn't understand that what we see as white light, it sees predominantly as a series of colors. So for example, a very bright sunny day where the sun's high in the sky where there's no clouds, the light is actually pretty blue. But if you're in your home and we shoot in tungsten light, traditional light bulbs, that light is incredibly orange. So the graphic that you see shows in color temperature range on the left-hand scale how color temperature impacts the color of light. Now the interesting thing is your eye will make it look white to you, but the camera only sees color temperature. So if we're in that bright northern sky, the light's blue. If it's overcast daylight, it's still bright, but it's a little bit blue. When we've got a noon daylight and direct sun in the summertime, right in July or August, that's really white light.
Very harsh.
Very harsh. And then as the sun starts to go down, or we're indoors, or working with different types of light, the light may tend to get warmer, what we call a lower color temperature. Now there is a commensurate change in light wavelength, but really that's not all that important to us as photographers. What we need to think about mostly is color temperature. So what color temperature allows us to do is to control how our camera sees the light, and we can also make some creative settings in our cameras to make the image look like it was shot in a different kind of light.
Absolutely, and sometimes that adds a completely different effect to the shot. Sometimes you want that effect, and other times it's there and it's the last thing you want.
Exactly. So sometimes, for example, with pictures of people, we might like to warm it up a little bit, make the skin tones pop.
A little more flesh tone color.
But if we're shooting products, it has to be perfectly white because those product colors have to be accurate. Otherwise, the brand manager is going to be pretty annoyed.
Really important for stock photography.
Hugely important for stock
You're trying
photography.
to take pictures of things, you're trying to promote it as a specific thing, sell it as a specific thing, and it looks totally different. It's not exactly acceptable.
Now, I think one of the key elements that we also need to think about is how we record images within our camera. And the thing I want to talk about here is called color space. And in every digital single lens reflex camera, there is this thing called color space that most of us ignore.
Most of us don't even know what it is.
Right, so in the sample image on your screen, we see the menu system from a Canon camera, and we see that color space is highlighted. And I've selected Adobe RGB. The default in pretty much every camera is sRGB. That stands for small RGB.
Adobe is software too, though. So is that the same thing that goes with that?
It's the same thing for all post-processing.
Okay.
And that's really important that we're matching our color space to where we do our software processing. Adobe RGB is an industry standard. It goes through the print industry, the imaging industry. But here's the key thing. You want the best possible color, the best possible images. You want to use the menu setting in your camera to change from sRGB to Adobe RGB.
So is that something everybody should be doing?
I recommend that to everyone. The idea is, well, it's like you were talking about with RAW. Did I want all the information or did I want part of the information?
Sure.
And really, it's a case of half of the information. Back in the days when we were very concerned about file size and the image quality that we could get out of our screens and our printers was, what's the word I'm searching for? Crap. We didn't care so much. Now we should care very much about the quality of the color that we're recording. The more data we have, just like in the case of RAW, the better the capability to get data. Now, in our prior episode where we talked about grayscale, we also talked briefly about tonal range. And I mentioned that our cameras aren't like our eyes. As Brian pointed out, our eyes see everything. But the cameras can only see 5 or 6 tonal ranges.
That's right.
So back, what, 30s?
In the 30s, yeah, I was there.
20s or 30s?
Yep, I remember that.
Oh, good, I'm glad you do. I surely don't. We had the concept of the tonal range. And all the tonal range was created for, and you may have heard this as the zone system, is how do I take all of this amazing quality of light and compress into something that film can see? And as much as we've come forward from the days of film, we still have limited tonal range available to us. So that graphic showed us and reinforced that we still only have about 5 stops of effective light. So we shoot for the best allow for 2 up and 2 down, and we're going to get really, really good control of tonality. Now, let's think about that in the context of source of light, type of light, direction of light, and color temperature, and bring that in together with that tonality. Okay. It sounds like a pretty complex picture, doesn't it?
Well, if you don't really know what it's supposed to be doing, at this point, it's a little bit complex.
So that's the important thing that we think about with light. We need to break it down so it's easier to understand.
A little more layman's terms oriented.
We have directionality. Where's the light coming from? How is it striking our subject? What's the angle of reflectance? How reflective is the subject? Brian's wearing a black shirt. That black shirt is not particularly reflective. It's almost like a matte finish. Mm-hmm. Same thing with denim. It's not very reflective, but if we were wearing, remember those, no, you're too young. Back in the 70s, rayon shirts were really popular with all kinds of interesting patterns and colors.
And reflectance and all kinds
of... And they
of...
reflected light in all manner. Yeah. And then people looked at their photographs and go, wow, you look like...
Trippy.
You look like one of those optical illusions out of Life magazine. It's really hard to see.
Yeah.
So the level of reflectance is important. Then the color temperature is also going to make a difference. So here in the studio, we're hitting with basically white light. And we look, well, I can't speak for you, but I look as normal as it's going to get. When we think about light, the color of the light is going to have an impact. If we shoot somebody under a greenish light, well, they're going to look sickly.
Yeah, it's
not
a good way to put it.
If we shoot, for example, under a warm light, or a light with a corrective filter, we're going to talk about that later today, yep, is the ability to create tonality with people with very pale skin or very thin skin. You may have seen folks who, when they're photographed with a traditional flash or traditional sunlight, you can almost see a bluish tint just because their blood vessels are close to the skin. So use of a warming filter or warm light can really help us. Then we lastly look at that tonal range. What are we exposing for? We talked about exposure in our episode on exposure, and we talked about metering for 18% gray. Getting the right meter reading so that when we made the exposure, we're referencing all the possible tonalities from light that's going to give us the best possible image. Mm-hmm. Now, coming up, you're going to talk about how the choice of light influences the choice of lens.
It's really important. A lot of people don't think about it, but when you're actually in different lighting situations, there's a lens for everything. So choosing the right lens for your needs is extremely important.
And looking at the light and understanding where the light's coming from and what the quality of the light is going to help us make the right lens choice. But to make that choice, remember those 4 key criteria: quality of light, directionality, color, tonal range, and the reflectance of the subject that you're going to hit. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to look at lenses.
Welcome back to Daytripper Television. Now, we're going to talk about how light influences your lens choices, but before we get to that, I just want to talk about quickly how to get the best possible color and choice of settings for your lens choice.
I know where you're going.
I think you do.
Raw rules.
I think we talked about that before.
Okay.
So if we cut to the clip that we have, one thing we want to make sure is that you understand how to switch to RAW. Because when you're in RAW, you can change your color selections after the fact much easier. So if you don't get it right away, you can do so much in post-production. And this is something we didn't have the luxury with film to do.
That's for sure.
So digital, if you look at the image that we have here, you can see the first option in the first menu on a Canon menu lets you choose your quality of image. And if you see, we already have the RAW image chosen. But if you look here, you can actually see when you go into that setting, you have choice. You can choose RAW, and you can choose JPEG. You can even choose RAW plus JPEG. RAW is RAW. There's no different levels of quality for RAW. If you're shooting in RAW, you're getting everything. So you don't need to worry about RAW, good, better, and best. It's just RAW.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key thing, and different cameras do things differently. You saw examples of RAW, small RAW 1, small RAW 2, and even different JPEG quality levels. In today's marketplace, cards are so cheap. Biggest image possible.
Go big or go home.
And speaking of go big or go home, how do we pick the right lens for that big image?
Well, this is the thing. If you're choosing to shoot in low light, you want to make sure that you have a lens that's designed to work in that environment. Now, if you're doing something that's distant and far and you have all the light to work with, you can go with a normal lens. For example, this guy right here, this is the Sigma 150 to 500. It's not known as the brightest lens available. It actually has an aperture at its far end of 6.3, which doesn't really let in tons of light. So if you're using a lens like this and you're taking pictures of wildlife like we did in the Wye Marsh, this is actually a lens that I got some of my best photos with, but it's not really made to shoot in very low light situations.
But bright sunlight, outdoors, what a great choice.
Absolutely, exactly right. You can go far and you have all the light you need to deal with. Now, if we look at something on the opposite side of the scale, say for example, I'm making photographs in a party environment. My grandmother had her 98th birthday recently. Amazing for her. It was a great time, but I didn't want to use flash. I didn't want to go around, flashing her in the eyes or do anything like that. So ultimately, I just basically went for a very bright lens, a lens that let in a lot of light,
right,
like the lens I have on my Nikon right here, or something like this 85mm f1.4, which we actually talked about yesterday as well, or on previous episodes. Ultimately, this lens lets in so much light, you're able to really shoot in very low light situations without the need for flash, and it gives you all that extra flexibility. Now, another example of where you'd use different lenses would be for a landscape.
Right.
Now, Sigma happens to make multiple different lenses for this application. They have a 10 to 20mm lens that's a fixed f3.5 aperture, or they have the same version that's a little bit less money, that's a 3.5 to a 5.6. It's not as bright, but you don't really need to worry about that.
Because it's a landscape. That's mostly outdoors.
Exactly. Not only is it outdoors, but it's also looking for fairly deep depth of field to begin with.
Right. Good point.
When you're shooting a landscape image, you want to make sure that you're actually seeing what's in front of you and what's farther down the way, like a tree in the background or a person in front of you or anything. So generally when I'm making a landscape photograph, I want to shoot at f11, f16. So the fact that the lens is only f3.5 doesn't mean a lot. So for that application, you can go with something like a 12 to 24 f3.5 to f5.6. You can go with something like a 10 to 20 that has a variable aperture. You don't really need to spend all the extra money on getting the brightest possible lens possible for that.
And I think that's a really important point that you're making, because when we talk about moving up just one f-stop in maximum available light, it's not double. It can be 4 times the cost. So for example, as we know, I'm shooting Canon. I did an evaluation between Canon's 85mm 1.8 lens and their 85mm 1.2 lens, which is enormous. It's beautiful. It's great sharp. It's a fabulous lens. It was also 4.5 times the retail purchase price for 2/3 of a stop.
That's right. Another comparison very similar to that would be, again, a lens like this one right here, the 150 to 500.
Right.
Well, this is a 150 to 500 with a variable aperture, but that is a 200 to 500. Yeah. It goes just as far, except it's an f2.8 at that far range. So because the aperture is so much more open, because it's letting in so much more light, the cost of the lens, well, this one here sells for about $1,300. That's $30,000. So there's a huge dramatic difference in price when you start to go for these bright lenses.
Exactly.
And sometimes it's worth it. If you're shooting a hockey game and you need to zoom across the rink and you need that fast shutter speed, well, you buy the 70 to 200 f2.8, smaller version of the same thing that's behind us.
Yeah.
It's worth the money if your kid's, in hockey and you want those best photographs that look like
seriously.
Exactly. You're trying to get an image for Sports Illustrated. You have to have the shutter speed so that it's sharp. You have to have the detail there, and you get that by starting with a lens that lets in more light.
If you think about what you've seen just in television, sports photographers on the sidelines of a football game, a hockey game, soccer, lacrosse, they've all got these monstrously large front element lenses. And that's not driven by magnification.
Right.
That's driven by the need for light.
Exactly.
The ability to drive enough light. Now, when we work with light and when we work with all these long lenses, that has an impact on our shutter speed choices, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The farther you zoom, the faster your shutter speed needs to be. There's a small little rule in photography, and now, again, we've talked that rules are meant to be broken, but at the same time, you have to understand the rule before you can break it. The small rule in photography is, if you're taking a picture of something that's not moving, a coffee mug, anything that's just sitting on a counter, anything like that that just doesn't move, a tree, doesn't matter. If you're taking a picture of something that's not moving, your shutter speed needs to be as fast or faster than your focal length if you're not using a tripod.
Right.
You have a camera in your hand. You're trying to take a photograph of a deer that's just sitting there. It's not moving, but it's a deer. Yeah. Basically, if you're shooting at 500 millimeters, you need to have at least a 500th of a second shutter speed. Now, if the deer's moving, you need to double or triple that. You have to overcompensate for that. Now, we have a graphic that actually shows what this means. And if we can switch to that, you'll see, again, at 12 millimeters, you can actually shoot at a 15th of a second. Now, this brings us to an extra point. If we look at this same graphic, if we can leave this up for a second or two, you'll see that there's full frame sensor and crop sensor. Now, why would that make a difference, Ross?
Well, when we look at a crop sensor, we're actually looking at only a portion of the image that the lens is projecting.
Now, again, a crop sensor would be a general purpose digital SLR.
You know, what lots of folks have, Nikon D3100s, 5100s, D90s, any of the Canon Rebels, the 60D, the 7D.
Most everything
most
but a 5D.
Everything that's out there, except for the really high-end gear.
Exactly.
So, lovely thing about crop sensors is it gives us a bit more magnification.
So a 500 millimeter on a Nikon D90 would be more like a 750 millimeter because it's magnified by 1.5.
And a 750 6.3 is actually reasonably quick.
That's right.
The challenge, though, is because we're actually working with less of the lens image, we have to be more careful around shutter speed.
Right.
Right?
So again, the fact that this is a 500 millimeter lens but magnified with a crop sensor is a 750, we're not shooting at 500 anymore. We're shooting at least 750th of a second shutter speed.
Exactly.
So now that we've covered all that, 300 millimeter, a 300th of a second, 100 millimeter, 100th of a second roughly, that's going to give us a lot of good information to help us understand where we need a tripod or where we can handhold the shot. Now, one of the other things that we want to do is we have this other tool at our disposal. We're talking about using your aperture to let more light in and your focal length, but what about your ISO? ISO, again, is that factor in the Bryan angle that allows for the adjustment of the sensitivity of your camera. So if you're taking a photograph in low light, let's say, for example, I was down in Toronto and I took some shots of this long-tailed duck, which I'd never seen before.
Right.
And it was actually at dusk. And here's the image right here. Now, I liked the duck. I thought it was a beautiful-looking animal. I'd never seen one before, so of course I was excited. But I was using a 400 millimeter lens that had an f5.6 aperture, not f2.8. Obviously, that would have cost me a crazy amount of money in my house, literally.
Basically.
So basically what I did was I just increased my camera's ISO to let more light in, which then gave me enough shutter speed that I can make the photograph. Now, the side effect of that, when you're shooting at higher ISO, we've talked about this previously, you do generate a little bit more heat on the sensor, which translates into this graining effect that you see. So the speckling on the photograph is actually caused by the ISO getting higher, but at least I was able to get the shot. So I got the shot, it would look beautiful, and I was totally happy with it, even though there was a little bit of grain. Now, if we flip it to the next image, here's an example of where you can use shutter speed rather than aperture, or rather than your aperture to let more light in. Here I used a tripod. This is taken at the fair at Young and Davis, and by using a slower shutter speed, it let more light in, which obviously lit up the image enough for me, but it also gave me this really neat blur effect. When the camera's on a tripod and doesn't move, but something in front of it does move with light attached to it, you actually see that as trailing light. So the image that you're seeing here, there's actually a ride that was going up and down on the left side of the image, and that showed as this blur of light, which I really like that effect. One of my favorite things is making photographs with a slower shutter speed. I love the trailing light, I love cars whizzing past, I love seeing all that detail. So again, that's more of a general purpose lens, doesn't really matter what your aperture is, but you're able to get the photograph that looks exactly as you like it, exposed properly and so on. Now, when we're walking around, for example, Newmarket has some great things going on at Fairy Lake during the holidays, the Festival of Lights and so on. I don't like to bring a flash, I don't like to bring a tripod, I like to just be casual and walk around. So for this, aperture will come into play, and ISO, the combination of the two. I was walking around, and I just happened to bring my 50mm lens that lets in a lot of light, and I was able to actually take this picture handheld, not using a tripod. Now, normally, if you're doing something like this, and you're using a lens that's wide angle, that doesn't let in a lot of light, unfortunately, you won't be able to do this handheld. You would need a tripod, but...
That's the beauty of picking the right lens for the light.
Exactly. They call this the Nifty 50 for a reason. You're able to take photographs that are in low light situations handheld. Now, another example of where you'd use a specific type of lens for specific lighting is on our day trip to the Niagara Falls. We went into the Butterfly Conservatory and we were able to make some really, really nice photographs, but unfortunately it's very low light in that situation. So here I was using a macro lens that gave me the ability to let a lot of light in. Macro lenses are generally f2.8. And I was able to get very, very close as well. So by using natural light, by using a little bit of ISO, I was able to make this photograph of the butterfly actually being born and coming out of its little pupae. That's what
Chrysalis.
Thank you.
No worries.
A proper terminology
That's what I'm
is
here
key.
for.
That's exactly
Just
right.
here to help.
And the detail was there, the sharpness was there, and I was able to do this handheld as well.
Now, one of the other key elements that the DSLR brings us when we choose lenses for low light, and I've got two quick images that I want to share with you that Brian's prepared for us. This first image was taken with a point-and-shoot camera in low light, and everybody's recognizable in it, but you can really see that grain that Brian was talking about. The colors don't have punch. Now, when I move to the next image, same concept. Band, concert lighting, but used a different camera.
Yeah, a slightly different camera. This was actually my Nikon D700. It's a full frame camera.
And it's optimized for low light.
And that's specifically why I bought it.
Exactly. So choosing the lens and the camera for the light really helps us a lot. Now, one trick that we would like to share with you is you can actually hint to yourself when things are going to blow out.
Blowout meaning too bright.
Too bright.
White
too much white.
information.
And these are called the blinkies. Now, nowhere in your camera menu system does it say
I think there's blinkies,
the blinkies
in the text in the back.
But the idea is to turn on the highlight warning indicator. What you see on your screen right now is how to turn on the highlight alert on a Canon camera. And it's similar on every other camera. You'll see something along the lines of highlight alert, enable or disable. There's nothing more to it than that. But when you turn that service on, when you take your photograph and then you look at the photograph on the rear screen, if the highlights are blown out, they're going to be flashing at you.
A lot of people think that that's actually an error with your camera, when in fact it's a tool to help you understand if you have zero information in that part.
Exactly. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to move into talking about how to manage white balance.
Hey there, and welcome back to Daytripper Television. Now, we're going to get into something a little bit more technical. White balance. We've talked earlier about exposure and how exposure actually influences our whites. You had a few images previously about a hockey game where at lower exposure the image was a little bit dark, a little bit yellowish, but when you increase your exposure, all of a sudden it went to a very white ice and white uniforms. Well, how does white balance actually differ from exposure, Ross?
It's a very, very good question, Brian, because white balance is really important. As important as exposure sometimes, but they are different things. Our cameras work with us to help us get great exposures, but they also work with us to help get great white balance. Today's cameras are smart enough to be able to detect the color temperature of the light that you're using when you make your photograph, and we'll try to adjust for it. Your cameras also have the capability to adjust for different light settings. So I've got a sequence of screens that I want to go through with you that show you the difference between how cameras can interpret different types of light and the corrections that they're going to make for you. The first image you see is coming from the editing program Lightroom, and this is the white balance as it was shot. Now, Brian knows I'm pretty picky about my light colors, so I used a proper set of gear to check my white balance before I made the exposure. And this is really how things would look. It's a part of a train, it's a bit rusty. You can see the histogram sort of in the upper right corner of your screen, although it's very small. You see it's mostly central, and you'll see different spikes in there for the red, the green, and the blue light. So that would be a correct white balance for this particular shot, for that source of light. But as I go to the next one, if I had let my camera automatically white balance, this is what I would have gotten. Because the day was cloudy, there was high overcast, the light was very blue, and this is in August, the camera would have seen all that blue light and would have tried to compensate for it.
And you can see that in the image.
And you would see that in the image. It would give you that very bluish cast. Now, that's not to say that automatic white balance doesn't work. It works, in fact, most of the time.
Most of the time, it actually works really well.
Where it can sometimes fail is an image exactly like this one, where the predominant color was solid, mostly rusty. Now, if I go to the next image, what we see here is how the camera would compensate for light on that cloudy day.
Now, you do have a few images that represent different results as well, right?
I do. So I think we'll probably just run through them all.
Okay.
So on the cloudy image, this looks a little bit warmer than the image that was properly adjusted. It's not distracting, and it's not bad at all.
Nope. But
Now,
it's not perfect.
How would we know to let the camera set cloud? Well, it's pretty easy to set cloud. All we're going to do is on our camera, when we choose our white balance setting, instead of AWB, we're going to choose cloudy.
And it'll actually have a little picture of a cloud.
Exactly. In our next image, what we're going to see is flash. This is what happens when the camera exposes for flashlight. And you see that this looks a little cooler, right? It's not as warm because flash tends to have a higher color temperature. So that's okay. But here's what happens when the camera thinks it encounters fluorescent light.
It's a totally different color than flash. It's
Right.
a totally different color than the sun. It's a totally different wavelength. Everything's different about
It's
fluorescent.
completely different. There's no match whatsoever with fluorescent. Fluorescent actually looks pretty green. So we see a magenta cast to the photograph because if the camera thought it was fluorescent, it would be adding magenta to level out that green.
Right.
That doesn't mean, though, that it's not a useful tool. So if you find yourself making photographs under fluorescent light and you take a look at the image on the back of your camera, do what we call as chimping. When we chimp, we look at that little screen. If it doesn't look right to you, it's not right. And so we can go into our menu settings and choose the color temperature, the white balance that's right for the shot.
You can even manually choose it.
Well, sure you can. If you're, a light scientist, you could pick your own Kelvin temperature rating. But fluorescent is there as an example of one way to tell your camera, hey, this is the lighting I'm dealing with. Please help me out. Another very common situation, in fact, in some parts of the world, more common than daylight, is shade. Shade is naturally blue. If you've ever seen a photograph taken where part of the subject's in bright sun and part of the subject's under the tree, look at the colors under the tree. They
Right.
take on a blue cast. So what we want our camera to do, if we're shooting in shade, we want to manipulate that white balance setting to shade.
That's right.
It's a simple setting. Any of us can do it. It's on the back of the camera. We're just going to choose shade, and that's going to just give us a little bit more warmth and a little bit more pop. And as you can see what it did to the original photograph, it actually pumped it up a little bit. Now, this image, tungsten light. What is tungsten light? Tungsten light is the light that we have in those old style incandescent light bulbs. It's orange. How do you correct for orange, Brian?
You adjust your camera.
Right. You set your camera setting to the tungsten setting. In the past, back in the days of film, we actually had to buy tungsten film. And that film was calibrated for the lower color temperature of tungsten light. We could also shoot with daylight film, but put on a deep, deep blue filter. But boy, that made getting available light photographs hard because we lost so much light through the filter.
Plus, you're always changing your filter.
Oh, what a pain that is.
1 minute you're doing this and you change it.
Now I can make a quick change on the back of my camera just under the white balance setting. Now, we get questions all the time. I'm pretty sure most folks have never even looked at the white balance setting.
Most folks leave it on auto because that's how the camera came.
That's how it comes. Can you make a better photograph? Yeah, you can. And that's the whole point of what we're trying to do here today, is help you make a better photograph. Now, one of the ways that we can do that is in our camera, we can calibrate it. In an earlier episode, I showed a little plastic kit called the Color Checker Passport. And I've got a representation on the screen of what that's showing you, which is called a Gretag Macbeth color scale. The beautiful thing about this color scale is it is standard across the photographic and printing industry. So what you do is you take your color card, could be that Color Checker Passport, could be literally a Gretag card, you take a photograph of it under the light where you're going to make your images. Then you take it away. Then you make your images. You can leave the camera set on any setting you want, really. Try to match it as close as you can. But it doesn't matter now, because what you're going to do is when you get into post-processing, you're going to say, this is my reference image. You're going to click with a little eyedropper tool on either the 18% gray or use the software that comes with your color checker, and it will automatically create a white balance setting for that sequence of images.
And it would apply to each image thereafter.
Absolutely. Until the light changes, you don't have to worry at all about setting white balance.
So you take your reference image in the environment you're shooting in.
Exactly.
And you set it aside for then.
And you forget about it.
And when you get home, you open up your image, you then open up your software, and you use that original reference image as the image to then choose your white balance and make sure it's all done properly.
And let the software help you out by getting the right color correction for the light source when you made the image. Now, some people say, oh man, that sounds like a lot of work. I could also be carrying a bag of filters and trying to correct for it, and carrying a color meter and a cinemeter and trying to do all that kind of stuff. It's so easy. Look, the shots are cheap. We take a shot with our digital camera of the color card in the light source.
But ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to help people understand how to actually make a proper photograph. So an extra step or two is expected. You're supposed to be able to go in this, and that's why everybody can't be a professional photographer, because not everybody actually wants to spend the time to make the best possible photograph.
The idea of using the white balance within your camera, the white balance settings, and for those critical shots, using a color checker helps you make better photographs. If you're ever hired to do a shoot, do you shoot a color checker first?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, because do you have a chance to reshoot the wedding?
There is one thing though. If you're looking at the back of your camera, that's a little TV that you're actually looking at. That's a lot different than the TV at home. That's a lot different than the TV on your computer.
Oh man, that's so important that you bring that up, because it sounds horrible. Your computer, your monitor, it's lying to you. It's kind of like when you go to buy a TV in the big box stores. What mode are they always turned on to?
Oh, they're on auto. They're just turned on and
super
left
extra
there.
bright, vivid, punchy,
Contrasty,
contrast.
trying to show as much possible brightness as they can.
And yet, when you get it home, it blows out your eyeballs. Your computer monitors, by default, are too bright and too contrasty. So one way to ensure that before you start editing your photographs, that you've got the monitor tuned properly, is to do monitor calibration. Make the monitor stop lying to you. Now I've got a sequence of 3 images that we're going to show you of 3 possible tools that you can use that don't cost a lot of money, that will work on your computer to set up the monitor correctly. The first one's called the Huey Pro, and literally it's suction cups to the front of your screen. It forces your monitor through displaying the 3 primary colors and a grayscale, and it calculates using software how to adjust the monitor so it's accurate. It also manages how the light changes in the room, because if the light in your room, your viewing room, is bright, that's going to change how the monitor looks if the light is off.
So it actually measures the light in your room
It measures
and the
the
light coming in
ambient
from the
light.
computer.
Another very popular tool is called the Spider.
Ooh, the Spider 4.
The Spider does the same thing. It hangs in front of the monitor, it runs its own software, it runs a sequence of photographs, and it constructs a color profile for your monitor. Now, the tool that I use myself, that I favor, is called the Color Monkey. And as Brian likes to joke with me, I pick the most expensive one on a relatively regular basis. The Color Monkey comes in a variety of flavors. The display is the most inexpensive. I use a tool called the Color Monkey Photo, which also does printer calibration, but it's exactly the same concept. We put the image up on the screen, we put the color checker in front of it, it scans, it constructs software, and builds your color profile that makes it absolutely right for you. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Brian's going to take us through some of the ways that he works in different light sources as a working professional. See you in a sec. Hey everyone, welcome back to Daytripper Television. In this section, I want to talk with my good buddy Brian about how he approaches different lighting scenarios. Now, we've seen images that Brian shot in all kinds of different lighting scenarios through the episodes. So I want to interview him specifically on the approach that he would take for a number of different situations. You okay with that?
Absolutely.
So, Brian, one of the most common things that folks have to deal with when they're making photographs is how to shoot good photographs indoors. And like you said, maybe they don't want to use a flash. A flash is going to be disconcerting. Maybe they don't know how to use the flash, or they don't like the flash photos they're getting. We're going to teach them how to fix that. But a lot of people just want to take great photographs indoors. What do you recommend to them?
Well, it also comes down to what you're shooting indoor. If you're shooting your house over Christmas and you want to get everything in focus equally, well then you don't really have to worry too much about shutter speeds and so on. You just make sure your camera's on a tripod, make sure you have a little bit longer exposure and nothing moves. Use a remote control.
Here's a great idea.
A remote control is a huge accessory that people should look into, whether it's corded like the one I use, or whether it's a wireless remote control so you can actually get yourself into the shot. A remote's a huge asset. You can do all kinds of different things. You can take your picture without moving the camera in any way. You can take that picture and you can lock your shutter wide open for an infinite amount of time until you release that lock. It gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, another thing for that same example is you want to use a lens that gives you the width and the feel of the photograph you're trying to get. And you also want to use your focus accurately. You want to make sure you put your focus point onto that specific subject that you're trying to really accentuate, your focal point. Now that's for the static indoor photo. But what if we were going to make photographs of people? Again, I used the example of my grandmother's 98th birthday earlier. If I were making this photograph, I'd want to walk around, and I'd want to have a lens that just lets in light to begin with.
So you'd want what we call a very fast lens.
A fast lens.
Something with a big aperture, like your Fast 50, like that 85-1.4 that we looked at earlier in this episode.
Exactly.
Something that's going to pass a ton of light.
Right. But the actual way I'm going to shoot is I'm going to shoot an aperture priority.
Why aperture priority?
Well, you have a lot of choices in your camera. And again, that Bryangle consists of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm working with the aperture and the ISO mainly here. It's going to automatically give me the faster shutter speed if I do this. So essentially, you have your camera, you put your mode into aperture priority, and you just open the aperture up as open as you can make it. By opening up your aperture, in aperture priority, again, we talked previously about aperture priority being a 50% automatic and a 50% manual mode. So ultimately what I end up doing is adjusting my aperture, and the shutter speed will fluctuate on its own. It'll automatically put my shutter speed as fast as it can go. So if I'm on aperture priority, I open up my aperture, in this case with this lens, to an f1.8, my shutter speed is going to stay as fast as it can stay. Now,
Okay.
what I then have to do...
Well, just before you go on.
Sure.
So basically, you're looking for the shutter speed like you showed in that shutter speed table that we had earlier.
That's right.
So that's a 50mm lens on a full frame camera, so you'd want a 60th of a second for hand holding.
Unless I'm taking pictures of people because they move.
Oh, right.
In which case I may want a 200th of a second shutter speed to stop that motion of a little boy playing with a balloon or of, you know, kids blowing out the candles, things like that.
Right.
So what I would then do is a very simple thing. I'm in aperture priority. I've got my aperture wide open and I've got the shutter speed somewhat happening for me, but not quite enough. Well, incrementally start to increase your ISO. Your
Right.
camera's going to feel more light slowly, and your shutter speed is going to gradually start to get faster and faster until you get to that 200th of a second plateau, and then stop. For the rest of the day, you're making your photographs, you're getting the shutter speeds you need, and you're stopping the motion of the people on the other side of the
Now
line.
that's great for indoors, but we encounter folks all the time who want to make better photographs at night. They want to take things like you showed, like that Ferris wheel or that ride that's moving, but they want elements that are sharp, they want elements that have that beautiful blur. The light meter, we already know, is going to get completely screwed up because of all the black. So what do you do for night shooting?
Well, that's where I would then shoot either in full manual mode, where I'm controlling my aperture for a certain depth of field, and I'm also controlling the shutter speed because I want that slower shutter effect. I want that blur of the lights. So for that, I would choose either full manual or even shutter priority, where the aperture will bounce around by itself, because I don't really need to worry about aperture in that case.
Got it.
So aperture priority, or sorry, shutter priority, choose a specific shutter speed, say maybe 5 seconds or 10 or 20 or even 30 seconds. If I'm trying to make a photograph of myself and I want to get out of the shot, get back into the shot, and it's very dark, I can do that and you won't even see me moving until I illuminate myself in that shot.
Right.
So you can really play around with a lot of different settings that way.
So how would that apply to something special like fireworks?
Fireworks are one of my
You've got a
favorite
special
things.
game you play with fireworks.
Yeah, we call this the hat trick. Now this is where a remote control is key. When you're making photographs of fireworks, first thing you want to do is check your composition. You don't want to just have a firework blank in the sky. You want to make sure you have some sort of a tree for reference or something in the shot that actually shows you the scope and the size of the firework. It shows you how grand it could really be. That's your first step. The second thing you want to do is you want to lock your camera down. You don't want any kind of motion. You don't want any kind of movement, or else you end up with those squiggly lines on the firework. Now another thing you want to make sure is you can actually choose the shutter speed. Now what I usually do is I choose bulb mode. Bulb mode means when I turn the camera on and I'm making my photograph, the shutter will stay open as long as I want it to. So I'm just going to put the camera into manual. I'm going to slow the shutter speed down until it's in bulb. And then when I take the picture, the shutter just stays open. I've locked it. It's not moving.
Right.
Until I release that lock, and then the shutter opens or closes and you've stopped your exposure. So by doing this, your shutter's wide open, the firework goes up, it blasts in midair, the camera's sensing all that. The light's traveling across the sensor and it's creating that image. But then what I do is I take my hat and I pop it in front of the lens. Now this is nighttime, folks. It's not seeing anything at this point. Unless somebody behind you with a point and shoot camera keeps popping their flash and it hits the inside of your hat, which has happened many times. Hopefully not to everybody.
Because that flash works so well.
Oh yeah,
on
the pop-up
fireworks.
works so great, 200 feet away. So anyway, you put your hat in front of the lens, your shutter's wide open at this point, it's still exposing to light, but then another firework goes off. Move the hat for a couple of seconds, and then put it back. Then another firework goes off. Move the hat and put it back, and you end up with one image with multiple impressions of light. So you have one image with several fireworks all on it.
That's amazing, Brian. Thanks very much. What we've covered in this episode, we started with the art, the physics of light, and then Brian shared with us how the light impacts your lens choice. Then we spent a bit of time talking about white balance and how to select the right white balance for the light you're using. We also talked about things like zones and tonal ranges. And I want to thank you very much for showing how ISO can be so powerful in manipulating where we push our light and how we use the light to choose the right lens for the job.
It really is that missing factor that people overlook quite often. And it's a tool that people should be using.
Absolutely. to help you with this, we've got another assignment for you. This is go shoot in different types of light. Shoot in daylight. Do some night shots. If there's an event, fireworks. Do the hat trick.
There you go.
Get out there and make some shots. And then what do they do with the shots that they've made?
Submit them to photo contest at DTPTV.com.
That's photocontest at DTPTV.com. In our next episode, we're going to take light to the next step.
You can take light to another step?
Yeah, you can make your own light. Join us again here at Daytripper Television. See you again soon, and take the lens cap off.